Hello and welcome to our dissertation proposal presentation. My name is Lindoguhle Lusha and I am joined by my colleagues Jaska Naidu, Ricardo Parayachi, Keegan Naidu, and Tavashin Pillay. The title of our dissertation is The Impact of Foreign Direct Investment on Stock Market Development in South Africa. Foreign direct investments, known as FDI, is direct investment inflows into a country. Direct investment refers to the cross-border activity where a foreign party has significant control or influence on the enterprise based in another economy, known as the host nation. FDI is a crucial part of globalization as it allows countries to establish long-lasting relationships. Between 2008 and 2019, emerging economies accounted for 51% of total FDI. The relationship between FDI and economic growth is positive, as FDI has shown to be an important contributor to the economic growth and increase in general welfare for the host nation. However, the relationship between FDI and stock market development is inconsistent and varies between economies. This study will be examining the impact of FDI on stock market development in South Africa. To determine the relationship, data between 2000 and 2019 will be gathered.
This section will outline our research problem, objectives, and questions. Many studies done on the relationship between FDI and South African SMD have mixed conclusions, therefore a clearer perspective is needed on the subject. The study will also offer major insights for South African policymakers to help them make better decisions. Our research objectives are as follows: to determine the direction of causality between FDI and SMD, and to determine the nonlinear relationship between FDI and South African SMD. Our research questions are as follows: what is the direction of causality between FDI and SMD, and what is the long and short run effect of FDI on South African SMD?
We will now discuss the empirical research and foundational theories that relate to the causal relationship between FDI and SMD, placing special focus on literature that pertains to developed versus developing countries and African nations. The modernization theory, which is based off the endogenous growth model, suggests that emerging economies are able to achieve economic development through capital injections like FDI, as they lack the necessary infrastructure and resources to achieve this on their own. In conjunction, the long-run theory suggests that emerging economies have a positive relationship between SMD and FDI in the long run. We expect South Africa to mirror this, being an emerging economy as well. We will now focus on literature pertaining to developed countries. In a study by Al-Saman, who used an error correction model, co-integration, and unit root tests to determine the effect that FDI had on SMD in developed GCC countries, a long-run positive bidirectional relationship was found. However, in the short run, this relationship was found to be insignificant, which shows that the use of FDI to spur development of the stock market in the short run would prove to be ineffective. We will now focus on literature that pertains to developing countries. Studies performed by Sumer, Gopalswamy, and Ramirez make use of co-integration tests, while Raza makes use of an autoregressive lab method and Granger causality test to determine the causal relationship that exists between FDI and SMD in emerging economies. Sumer and Gopalswamy find positive long-run bidirectional relationships, while Raza finds a negative long-run relationship, and Ramirez finding insignificant relationships between the variables. This now shows contradicting ideas throughout our literature between developed and developing countries. Developing countries seem to have contradicting ideas throughout their literature, with some studies revealing positive, others negative, and some insignificant. We will now look at the literature that pertains to African nations and see how this compares to these studies.
We now move on to the literature review within the context of the African countries. The three authors on my screen employed the Granger causality test and found a significant positive long-run relationship between FDI and SMD. However, within the African economy as a whole, positive bidirectional causality was seen. However, within Zimbabwe, no direct causality was seen. Keeping within the context of the African countries, and in particular the Ghanaian economy, the vector error correction model was used to find a positive long-run relationship. This was contrary to the Nigerian economy, whom used the error correction model instead to find an insignificant long-run relationship, however a significant positive short-run relationship.
The data used in the study is annual secondary data obtained from the World Bank Development Indicators. Period chosen is 2000 to 2019 as there is no missing data, and it is the closest to 1994 to capture the effects of an opening and emerging country's economy. The short form of the variables used in the following equations are in brackets. Stock market capitalization as a percentage of GDP is used as a proxy for SMD, as it is also considered a less arbitrary measure. As a proxy for FDI, we use FDI net inflows as a percentage of GDP. Finally, inflation, real effective exchange rate index, and gross domestic savings are used as controls to avoid omitted variable bias. In this slide are the equations used to determine the relationship between FDI and SMD. In the first equation, we regress SMD on lags of FDI, SMD, and the control variables. In the second equation, we regress FDI on lags of SMD, FDI, and the control variables. Alpha naught is the intercept. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and theta represent the coefficients on SMD, FDI, inflation, real effective exchange rate, and GDS. P represents the lag length, and Vt is the serially uncorrelated disturbance term, with a mean of 0 and a constant variance.
We now move on to the diagnostic testing to be conducted in our research. Firstly, a unitary test will be done through the augmented Dicker-Philly test and Phillips-Perron test. Thereafter, a test for normality will be conducted through the Haraki-Barra test. Thereafter, serial correlation through the Lagrange multiplier test, heteroskedasticity through White's test, and finally multicollinearity through the tolerance test and analysis of variance inflation factors. We now get into the heart of our methodology. Firstly, a vector autoregressive model will be employed to determine the optimal lag structure of all the explanatory variables. Second, a Johansson's co-integration test will be done through the trace test and maximum eigenvalue test. This Johansson's co-integration will be done to determine if a long-run relationship is existent between foreign direct investment and stock market development. This has to be done before we can proceed to the vector error correction model. The vector error correction model will be used to determine the nature and the significance of the long-run versus the short-run relationship between FDI and SMD. This will answer our research questions 2 and 3 described above. Finally, we will employ the Granger causality test. This will be used to determine if bidirectional causality is existent between FDI and SMD, thus answering our research question 1 described above. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange is Africa's most developed and leading stock market. While previous studies have been conducted with regards to emerging economies like South Africa on the relationship between FDI and SMD, these have proved inconclusive as seen in the literature review. While some studies have determined a significant relationship, other relationships have been determined as insignificant. By employing the methodologies described above, we will be able to determine the nature and significance of the long-run versus the short-run relationship between FDI and SMD within South Africa. These will then answer our research objectives as also described above. And that brings us to the end of our presentation on the impact of foreign direct investment on stock market development within South Africa. We do hope that we were able to supplement your knowledge on this really important and current topic in finance. Please feel free to ask us questions at the end, and thank you for your attention.